It was not much of a surprise, given what we know about his turn through public life, that Mr. Bannon was very pugnacious outside the courtroom today. He said he was going to take down the Biden regime. That's what he works on every day. He basically declared war on the January 6th investigation. That sort of bluster from him, again, not surprising. It does appear strategically, though, that he and his counsel are going to try to do everything in their power to slow down the proceedings against him and drag them out. Is that what you and your fellow members of Congress on this committee who's conducting the investigation, is that what you were expecting?
Yes, in the sense that when Steve Bannon decided he was going to essentially ignore the law, ignore the committee's subpoena, that he wanted to make a political issue out of this. He wanted to delay and drag it out as long as possible, once again, prove his loyalty to the former president. But look, he had 4 years in which he was given the impression, apparently, that he was above the law. He was brought into the Congress before our committee when it was chaired by a Republican, refused to answer questions during the Russia investigation. Republicans refused to hold him accountable. And then later he was indicted for stealing money from Trump supporters to build a wall that Mexico was supposed to pay for, but of course didn't. And Donald Trump pardoned him. So no wonder he feels like he's above the law. But that's run straight into a Justice Department no longer under Bill Barr, but one that is devoted to equal application of the law. And I'm glad to see that that is the view of the Justice Department. It's so important.
In terms of Mr. Meadows and whether or not he is going to find himself ultimately to be in the same predicament as Mr. Bannon, are there differences in the circumstances for these two witnesses? Have they handled the request from the committee differently? Is Bannon defying the committee's authority, the investigation's authority, in a way that's more serious than what's happening with Mr. Meadows? Or are they essentially taking the same strategy and therefore Mr. Meadows should expect the same kind of treatment, even potentially by the Justice Department?
Well, they've taken the most significant step in identical fashion. That is, they refuse to even show up. And there are broad categories of questions for both of these men that don't go, for example, to any communications between them and Donald Trump. There were communications between, for example, Steve Bannon and members of Congress, between Steve Bannon and the planners of the January 6th rally on the Mall. None of that is even conceivably covered by any kind of privilege. So in that sense, both men have the same fundamental position, weak position. That is, they simply failed to show up, and there's no right to do so. There are differences in the sense that Meadows was a current White House staff member. Steve Bannon hadn't been in the White House in years. So there are differences, but ultimately those differences don't affect the fact that there's no immunity to simply say, I ain't showing up. And that's probably the most significant factor when the committee decides what step is next.
Let me also ask you about recent revelations about what happened on and leading up to January 6th that have been published in ABC News reporter Jonathan Karl's new book, which is yet to come out, but it's apparently a jackpot of news even before it gets formally published. The latest revelation from Mr. Karl's reporting is that there was yet another memo, I guess we'd call it, another legal-ish argument put to Vice President Pence and his staff, essentially directing him to overturn the election results to keep President Trump in power, even though he had lost the election. We know about one of those from John Eastman, who has been subpoenaed by the committee. We know of another by Mr. McEntee, who was working in the White House, who made that sort of argument to Mr. Pence. But now a Trump campaign lawyer, Jenna Ellis, apparently also made this sort of argument, put this sort of pressure on Vice President Pence, telling him, giving him an instruction manual to overturn the election results and keep Trump in power. Were you and the other members of the committee previously aware of that, or is that news to you the way it was news to all of us when Mr. Karl wrote his book?
You know, I can't go into specifics about what we knew and when we knew it, but I can say that we have learned a lot from very good investigative journalism that has supplemented what we know and has helped inform many of our questions and even informed the choice of witnesses. So these kind of reports that are being published now can be really useful to us and our investigators. And it just shows how much there is to expose to the public. For those that say, don't we know everything already? The answer is no. There's so much we don't know about what went into the pressure campaign against the vice president, to try to call on him, to coerce him to ignore his constitutional duty. We want to know what kind of internal communications and discussions there were about the bogus nature of these legal arguments, to show the willfulness of these efforts to, in a unconstitutional and corrupt way, overturn our elections. If we're going to protect the country going forward, all of this has to be exposed to the light of day.